Kill him! Oh, knocked the decoy.
What happens in the 4 seconds after a duck flock locks its wings over your spread that determines whether those birds land in front of your gun or flare wild at 30 yards and never come back? Most hunters can describe that moment without any prompting. The flock is cupped, dropping, everything looks perfect, and then something shifts and the birds are climbing out hard and gone before you can get the gun up. It happens on calm mornings and windy mornings and mornings when the calling was good and mornings when it was off. It happens to experienced hunters who have everything dialed in, and it happens to beginners, and the common explanation is usually calling or decoys or luck. Those are rarely the actual explanation. A guide who has been putting clients on ducks in the Missouri River bottoms of Holt County for 22 seasons showed me a framework he uses for every flock, every morning, every hunt. He calls it the 4-2-4 rule, and it has nothing to do with spread size or decoy brand or which call he is holding. It is a decision protocol that organizes exactly what he does and exactly what he does not do at every phase of a flock's approach. And it is the most useful single piece of waterfowl hunting instruction I have received in 15 years of chasing ducks in the Mississippi and Central Flyways. The guide's name is Dennis Pryor. He built his reputation running public ground on the Missouri River and at Squaw Creek National Wildlife Refuge in Holt County, which is one of the most consistently productive migration concentration areas in the mid-continent flyway. He has put thousands of birds in front of clients over 2 decades, and he can watch a flock from first appearance to final commitment and tell you within the first 60 seconds whether that group is going to finish. His prediction accuracy on committed flocks is something I cannot explain fully. The 4-2-4 rule is his working theory on why some approaches work and most do not. Stay through to the end. Dennis has a specific technique for re-engaging a flock that has passed the spread and appeared to move on, and it contradicts virtually everything in the standard advice on how to work a reluctant flock. It takes about 10 seconds to execute, and on 3 specific occasions I watched him use it on birds I had mentally written off. It turned 2 of those 3 flocks back into the spread for shot opportunities. I will cover it at the end. A quick note on regulations before anything else. Federal waterfowl regulations require a federal duck stamp and your state's waterfowl license and HIP registration. Steel shot is mandatory everywhere for waterfowl. Season dates and species limits are set annually by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. Missouri runs a split season with specific dates, shooting hours, and species-specific limits that change year to year. Your state's regulations for the current season are available on your state wildlife agency website in about 2 minutes. Look before you load the truck. The first 4 inches, the 4-2-4 rule, is the 4-factor commitment check, and it is the part of the system that most hunters never do because it requires discipline about when not to call rather than instruction about when to call. Dennis checks 4 conditions before he ever blows a note on a flock that appears in his zone. The zone is the area within roughly 600 yards of the spread, about 6 football fields, where approaching ducks are visible and potentially workable. A flock that is visible at 600 yards and on a trajectory that might bring it within range is in the zone. Before the first note leaves his call, Dennis runs through 4 factors in sequence. If all 4 are favorable, he calls. If any one of them is not, he waits, adjusts, or does not call at all. Factor 1 is wind angle relative to the landing hole. As covered in a previous video on decoy geometry, ducks land into the wind, which means the approach corridor is always from the downwind side. The critical question is whether the flock's current flight path is aligned with the approach corridor that leads to the landing hole. A flock flying from the north on a north wind is ideally positioned for an approach into a spread whose landing hole faces north. A flock flying from the east on a north wind is in a crosswind position that requires it to turn and reorient before it can approach the landing hole correctly. Calling a crosswind flock hard is one of the most common mistakes in duck hunting. It pulls the flock's attention toward the caller without giving the flock a natural approach path. The birds circle, orient, sometimes work, and frequently leave. Dennis waits for a crosswind flock to complete at least 1 full circle before calling, because the circle itself is the flock trying to find the approach angle. 1 circle lets him evaluate whether the flock is working toward the correct approach angle or moving away. If after 1 circle the flock is still crosswind, he adjusts his calling target to a different group rather than continuing to work a flock that is not geometrically positioned to finish. Factor 2 is sun angle relative to the hide. A duck approaching a spread makes a visual assessment of the entire scene from altitude, and that assessment includes whether anything in the scene reflects light in a way that reads as unnatural. A hunter's face, a gun barrel, the interior of a boat blind, the shiny surface of wet decoy cords, all of these reflect light differently from the surrounding vegetation and water, and an incoming duck at 50 feet, roughly the height of a 4-story building, can detect that reflection. Dennis hunts with his face either covered or pointed down on bright, calm mornings, and he positions his hide so that the sun is behind him rather than in front of him during the approach. He checks the sun position relative to his blind every time a flock enters the zone, because the sun moves and a hide that was ideal at 7 in the morning has a different light relationship at 9:30. This sounds obvious, and it is. Most hunters check their hide once and then forget about it. Factor 3 is decoy motion status. Dennis requires that his decoys are actively moving before he calls a single note on a committed flock. Not that they might be moving, that they are visibly moving. On a calm morning with no wind, he runs a jerk cord, which is a simple system where a length of cord attached to 2 or 3 decoys runs through an anchor point on the blind floor and can be pulled and released to generate realistic motion throughout the hunting day. He does not turn the jerk cord off when birds are working and turn it on when they are gone. It runs continuously. The logic is specific. A flock making its commitment assessment from altitude wants to see activity. Active feeding motion says the area has been undisturbed long enough for birds to relax into feeding behavior. No motion says the water has been still, which either means nothing has been there recently or something disturbed it and the birds left. Dennis considers a completely still spread on a calm morning one of the single most effective ways to prevent bird commitment, regardless of how well everything else is set up. Factor 4 is calling distance. This is the one that surprises most hunters the first time Dennis explains it. He has a minimum calling distance for each flock approach, not a maximum. He does not call flocks that are less than 150 yards, roughly 1.5 football fields, from the spread at the time he first notices them. The reason is behavioral. A duck that is already inside 150 yards and heading generally toward the spread is in the middle of its visual commitment process. It is reading the spread with its eyes, assessing the decoys, evaluating the motion, looking for detail that confirms or contradicts the commitment it is moving toward. Calling at that distance adds an audio stimulus that requires the bird to shift some of its processing attention away from visual assessment and toward the sound source. That shift introduces uncertainty into the commitment process. The bird was visually assessing and confirming. Now it is also audio locating. Where is that sound? Is it consistent with where the birds are? Dennis is quiet under 150 yards on birds that are already working toward the spread. He does not confirm, does not reassure, does not add the feed chuckle that he was planning. He is completely silent. The decoys close the deal. Think about that for a second. Most hunters are calling their hardest when birds are inside 50 yards, exactly the distance where calling is most likely to introduce uncertainty. The bird was about to land. The call says something is back there making noise. What is it? Where is it? Is that right? Silence under 150 yards on committed birds is the single hardest discipline in duck hunting, and it is the one that produces the clearest, measurable improvement in finished birds per flock worked. In my observation across multiple hunts with Dennis, that is not a controlled study. It is consistent enough that I changed my approach completely and will not go back. The second number in the 4-2-4 rule is the 2-call maximum, and it addresses the most common behavioral error in waterfowl calling, continuing to call throughout the entire approach rather than calling strategically at 2 specific moments and then stopping. Dennis makes 2 calling interventions per flock approach. Not 2 notes, 2 interventions, each of which is a brief calling sequence. Those 2 interventions happen at specific moments in the approach sequence, and he does not deviate from the structure regardless of what the birds are doing, with one exception covered at the end of this video. Intervention 1 is the attention call, delivered when the flock is between 300 and 400 yards out, roughly 3 to 4 football fields, and on a flight path that may or may not bring it toward the spread. The attention call is a 5 to 8 note hail or greeting sequence, loud enough to be heard at that distance, designed to turn the flock's attention toward the spread. It is not designed to bring the flock in. It is designed to say, something is down here worth checking out. Dennis blows the attention call once, then goes completely silent for a minimum of 90 seconds. If the flock is going to turn toward the spread, It will do so within 90 seconds of the attention call in most cases. If it is not turned within 90 seconds, it is either moving away from the spread or it is on a flight path that will bring it in without additional calling. Either way, more calling at this stage does not improve the outcome and may make it worse. Intervention 2 is the commitment call, delivered when the flock is between 50 and 80 yards out, roughly half to 3/4 of a football field, and has made its initial turn toward the spread, or is circling in a way that suggests active interest. The commitment call is a soft 3 to 5 note sequence of feed chuckles or contented quacks at roughly 40% of the volume of the attention call, delivered once and then stopped. This call says, "Birds are down here feeding, everything is calm, come on in." After the commitment call, the call goes away. Dennis sets it down or puts it in a pocket. It does not come back up regardless of what the birds do next. The reason for 2 interventions rather than continuous calling is about information management. At the attention distance, the flock needs one piece of information. Something is worth investigating below. At the commitment distance, the flock needs one piece of information. It is safe to commit. Both pieces of information can be delivered in a single brief calling sequence. Every additional call after those 2 sequences adds information. The flock is already processing and introduces the possibility that the additional information is inconsistent with the visual picture the decoys are presenting. A real feeding flock does not make a constant stream of noise. It makes occasional social sounds against a background of feeding activity. The calling is supposed to represent 1 or 2 birds in a feeding group. 1 or 2 birds making occasional social sounds, 2 sequences, then decoys. I ran continuous calling on working ducks for 11 years before Dennis showed me the 2-call maximum in action. I argued with him about it in my head for 2 seasons before my notebook convinced me. On hunts where I tracked flock-to-bird ratios, my finished bird percentage on committed flocks was significantly lower in seasons where I called throughout the approach versus seasons where I adopted the 2-call maximum. That is my data on my ground. Your conditions will differ, but the pattern was consistent enough across 2 full seasons that I stopped arguing. The failure modes for the 2-call maximum are worth naming because there are conditions where the standard 2-call structure does not produce results and a different approach is required. Heavy overcast with no wind produces the most reliable exception. In this condition, ducks are generally less responsive to calling overall and may require additional audio engagement to maintain attention through multiple approach loops. On flat, calm gray mornings in the Missouri River bottoms, Dennis sometimes extends intervention 1 to a slightly longer sequence and runs a 3rd brief intervention between the 1st and 2nd, adding 1 additional low-volume greeting call at the 120 to 150-yard distance when a flock has been circling without dropping altitude. This is the only exception he makes to the 2-call rule, and he makes it specifically in the absence of wind motion in the decoys, which is the condition where the spread is most likely to look static and dead. The same birds that require a 3rd call intervention on a flat, calm morning will commit on 2 calls or fewer on a morning with enough wind to create natural decoy motion. The wind does the work the 3rd call does on calm mornings. When you have wind, you probably need fewer calls than you think. When you have no wind, you may need slightly more. Loud calling when birds are actively flaring is also a failure mode. A flock that tips its wings, retracts its feet, and begins climbing out is not going to be brought back by a loud call. It has seen something it did not like, and it is leaving. Loud calling at a flaring flock produces a flock that continues to leave while now also having confirmed that something near the spread is worth avoiding. Dennis goes completely silent the moment he sees wings tip upward on a departing flock. If there is another flock in the area, he covers his face and does not move. If there is no other flock in the area, he uses a specific technique to re-engage, which I will cover in the payoff. The second 4 inches, the 4-2-4 rule, is the 4-second window, and it is the physical discipline that determines whether a committed flock becomes birds in the bag or birds that flare at the last moment and get talked about at lunch. When a group of ducks locks its wings for a final descent, the commitment is not yet complete. The birds have made a preliminary landing decision and they are executing it, but they are still processing visual information throughout the descent. A duck on final approach at 30 yards, roughly the distance from home plate to just past the pitcher's mound, is still capable of detecting a gun barrel lifting, a hunter's face turning upward, A hand moving to release a jerk cord. Any movement in or near the blind in the final phase of the approach triggers an abort response that the birds execute in about half a second. It is not a considered decision. It is a reflex. You will not be faster than the reflex. The only option is to not trigger it. The 4-second rule is this: from the moment wings lock on a committed flock, do not move for 4 seconds. Not 1 second, not 2. 4 seconds of absolute stillness from the moment you see wings lock, which is visible as the bird's wingtips spreading wide and the body tipping slightly backward and feet extending downward. That 4 seconds allows the birds to drop from their commit altitude, roughly 30 to 50 feet in most approaches, to shooting position of 15 to 20 feet. At that lower altitude, the birds are inside the range window where a clean shot is achievable. They have committed fully enough that aborting the landing would require significant altitude recovery, and the hunter can rise slowly from the blind rather than rapidly, which reduces the visual trigger intensity. Rising slowly from a blind when birds are inside 20 yards, roughly the distance from the pitcher's mound to the catcher, feels wrong. Every instinct says to get the gun up fast. The birds are right there and they might leave. The physics say the opposite. A duck that is inside 20 yards and dropping has committed its momentum to the landing. Reversing that momentum requires 2 to 3 seconds of wing work and altitude recovery. A hunter who rises slowly over 1 full second and mounts the gun in another half second has 4 to 5 full seconds of shooting time before the bird can realistically flare and escape clean. A hunter who rises fast in a quarter second and mounts immediately is triggering the flock's abort reflex in the same window where they otherwise would have been committed and dropping. The fast mount gets a flock that was 3 seconds from being in range. The slow mount gets a flock that is in range. I did this wrong for more seasons than I would like to describe. My buddy, who I have hunted with for 12 years, and I had a running argument about this. He mounted faster than me and said I was too slow. He was getting birds that I thought I should be getting first. It took an afternoon watching Dennis specifically from outside the blind while he guided a client group to see what the 4-second hold looked like from a bird's perspective angle. The birds drop, the blind holds still, the birds are in the decoys, the blind opens, and a slow rise begins. There is a full second between when the birds commit and when the first hunter's head appears above the blind edge. By that point, the birds are 8 feet off the water, roughly the height of a standard basketball backboard, moving slowly, and presenting a shot that even a nervous shooter handles cleanly. The 4-second hold is the skill that guides develop before almost anything else because it is the one that loses the most birds in the hands of inexperienced hunters. A guide who puts the right number of decoys in the right configuration in the right location and calls correctly twice and then lets clients mount too early has just wasted everything that came before it. There is a connection here to the decoy spread geometry video I did previously. The landing hole in that system is specifically designed to position birds inside 20 yards at final commit, where the 4-second window produces the highest quality shots. If your spread has birds finishing at 45 yards because the landing hole geometry is off, the 4-second hold is less relevant because the birds are not in optimal shooting position at commitment. The two systems work together. Geometry produces close committed birds. The 4-2-4 timing sequence ensures those close committed birds are shot cleanly rather than flared by premature movement. The conditions where the 4-2-4 rule is least effective are worth naming because they are real, and they will produce mornings that feel like the system failed when it did not. Days with extreme barometric pressure drops, the severe weather fronts that send the big pushes of birds through the flyway, often produce birds that are moving hard and do not circle or work spreads in the standard pattern. These birds are in directional travel mode, not feeding mode. They are covering distance and looking for staging areas. A flock of mallards moving hard at 200 feet on a weather day is not going to respond to the 4-2-4 approach sequence because it is not in the behavioral state. The sequence is designed to engage. In those conditions, the most productive setup is position rather than calling skill, meaning you want to be under a flight line rather than trying to pull birds off their track. The 4-2-4 rule is a committed flock management tool, not a flight line tool. Highly pressured public land birds late in the season present a different challenge. By mid-December, on public water that has been hunted consistently, the surviving birds have associated virtually every combination of decoys and calling with danger. They will work spreads from 60 to 80 yards, roughly from behind the pitcher's mound to the outfield edge of the infield grass, without dropping to commitment distance regardless of how correctly the approach sequence is managed. In those conditions, Dennis makes two adjustments. He significantly reduces decoy count to 12 or fewer, and he eliminates intervention 2 from the sequence entirely, calling only once and going silent much earlier in the approach. The pressured birds are not reading the full spread as a positive signal. A smaller, quieter setup gives them less to pattern as dangerous. The success rate on committed birds drops significantly late season regardless of technique, and that is a realistic expectation rather than a failure of the approach. The last piece I want to cover is the re-engagement technique Dennis uses on flocks that appear to have left, and the reason it works is rooted in a behavioral pattern that I did not understand until he explained it. A flock that has passed the spread and is moving away at 60 to 70 yards, roughly from beyond the outfield fence to 2/3 of the way to the warning track, has not necessarily committed to leaving. It has passed the spread without committing, which means the spread did not produce enough positive signal to trigger a turn during the approach. The standard response from most hunters is to call hard and loud at the departing birds. This almost never works and sometimes makes things worse because it produces a loud, frantic call from a direction the birds have already moved away from, which reads as chasing rather than invitation. Dennis waits until the flock is at roughly 80 yards on the departure, watches the flock's lead bird for a specific behavioral signal, which is the lead bird's head orienting slightly downward rather than forward, and at that moment delivers a single short feed chuckle sequence at reduced volume, about 30% of his normal attention call volume, then complete silence. The downward head orientation in the lead bird is the signal that the flock has slowed its departure momentum and is re-evaluating. It is the bird equivalent of stopping while walking away and looking back. If Dennis delivers the feed chuckle while the flock is still in active departure with heads forward and altitude gaining, the call is ineffective. If he delivers it at the moment of re-evaluation indicated by the head drop, the flock turns back toward the spread in a significant fraction of cases in his experience. He estimates roughly 1 in 3 on his best water, 1 in 5 on heavily pressured public ground. I watched him use this on 3 occasions across 2 hunts in Holt County. 2 of those 3 flocks turned back. 1 did not. He called one of the 2 that turned back with enough time to land, and I was in position for a clean pair when they settled. The other turned back but did not fully commit on the return loop and left again without shooting position. The 3rd flock did not turn regardless of the technique, which he said afterward was because he misjudged the head orientation signal and called a half-second too late when the birds had already recommitted their departure. The timing is that precise. You get 1 application of the re-engagement call, and if the timing is off, the flock is gone. A Winchester SX 4 and 12 gauge with a modified choke running heavy shot steel and 3-inch loads handles the shot presentation that the 424 system produces, which is birds inside 20 yards, dropping or hovering, positioned directly in front of the blind. At that range, a modified choke and a quality steel load produce clean kills without requiring the tight pattern of a full choke. The SX4 cycles fast enough that a second shot is available before the flock has cleared range on a 2-bird limit, which matters when the spread geometry and the timing sequence produce a clean landing in close quarters. The 4-2-4 rule is not a guarantee. There are mornings when birds are stale and nothing produces. There are mornings when the wind is wrong and the hide is compromised, and the best discipline in the world does not overcome the conditions. What the rule does is eliminate the variables that hunters control, so that when conditions are favorable, the approach to every flock is the same systematic process rather than an improvised response to each individual group. Guides who produce consistent results across many seasons and many clients are not necessarily better callers or better shooters than their clients. They are more consistent in their process across a much larger sample of flocks. The 4-2-4 rule is a way to import that consistency into your own hunting without 22 seasons of guide work to build it. Check the 4 conditions before you call. Call twice and stop. Hold for 4 seconds after wing lock. Run that process on every flock this season and keep notes on what happens at each phase. The data you collect on your own ground with your own birds will tell you more than anything else about whether it works and where to adjust for your specific conditions.